That flawless knight in shining armor is a beautiful lie. We are about to dismantle 20 of Hollywood's most stubborn myths about medieval knights, replacing fantasy with the gritty, fascinating truth. By the end, you will see these legendary figures in a completely new light, armed with knowledge that forever separates cinema from history. What was the real weight of their iconic armor, and how many of them were actually wealthy lords? The answers will upend everything you thought you knew. What do you believe is the biggest difference between a storybook hero and a real historical warrior? That pristine, gleaming suit of steel is our first myth to fall. The image of a knight reflecting the sun like a walking mirror is a cinematic invention, a visual shorthand for nobility and power that often betrays historical reality. While a knight certainly cared for his armor, the battlefield was no place for a polishing contest. Think of the practical challenges. A highly reflective surface is a beacon, announcing your position to every archer on the field. More importantly, maintaining that mirror finish against rain, mud, and the constant threat of rust was a nearly impossible task during a campaign. Instead, knights employed far more sensible methods. Many suits were chemically treated to have a dark, blued or blackened finish. Others were painted, sometimes in vibrant colors or with decorative designs that identified the wearer. A common practice was to apply a thin layer of wax or oil, which created a dull, protective coating. This was not about neglect, but sophisticated preservation. Their gear showed the marks of its purpose, dented from a deflected blow, scratched from travel, and stained from the elements. At a place like Agincourt, knights struggled through a sea of thick mud under a relentless arrow storm. Their world was one of churned earth, sweat, and driving rain, where functional, reliable protection was the only true luxury. The surviving armor we see in museums, often beautifully decorated, represents ceremonial or jousting gear, the Sunday best of warfare. The everyday field armor was a tool, worn by a professional who understood that a little grime was a fair trade for staying alive. So if their iconic look is misunderstood, what about the very symbol of their power, the legendary longsword? That iconic weapon, the longsword, is itself wrapped in a second layer of Hollywood fiction. We see it drawn in every scene, the knight's constant companion and primary tool for any conflict. Yet this fixation on a single blade drastically shrinks the medieval warrior's world. In reality, a knight's arsenal was a carefully chosen collection of tools, each with a specific purpose on the chaotic chessboard of the battlefield. For the initial, earth-shaking impact of a cavalry charge, the lance was king. This was not a weapon for prolonged dueling. It was a single-use spear of immense force, designed to shatter formations on contact. Once the charge was spent and the fight descended into a brutal press of bodies, other tools came to the fore. Against an opponent clad head to toe in plate, a sword's sharp edge was often frustratingly ineffective. Instead, knights would reach for weapons built for concussive force like the mace or the war hammer. These were not crude clubs, but sophisticated pieces of metalwork designed to transfer energy through armor, to stun and incapacitate without needing to pierce the steel. Many knights, especially when fighting on foot, favored the poleaxe, a versatile polearm that combined the functions of an axe blade, a hammer, and a spear point, giving them reach and multiple ways to attack. Historical combat manuals, like those written by the Italian master Fior dei Liberi, show this diversity clearly, instructing knights in grappling, dagger work, and the use of these various weapons. The sword was deeply important, of course, a symbol of status and a knight's personal sidearm, but it was often the weapon of last resort. On a field like Crécy, where storms of English arrows darkened the sky, a knight's sword was virtually useless until he could close the distance, a task that proved tragically difficult for many. To imagine a knight using only his sword in a battle is like picturing a modern soldier using only a pistol, ignoring the rifle, grenades, and support weapons that define their actual combat role. This narrow cinematic view not only misrepresents their equipment, but also underestimates their tactical intelligence and adaptability. If their choice of weapon was so pragmatic and varied, it makes you wonder how much of their famous code of conduct was also a matter of practical reality, rather than pure storybook virtue. The romantic ideal of a universally chivalrous knight is perhaps the most persistent and misleading myth of all. We are taught to see them as medieval superheroes, bound by an unwavering oath to defend the helpless and fight with honor. While beautiful poems and songs of the era certainly promoted these lofty ideals, they were more like a guiding star than a map for daily life. The historical record paints a picture that is infinitely more complex and frequently at odds with this noble image. For many knights, the brutal calculus of warfare, the relentless pursuit of land, and the raw struggle for political power took clear precedence over poetic notions of gallantry. Consider the grim reality of medieval warfare. When an army laid siege to a town or marched through enemy territory, it was often the knights and their men who were responsible for pillaging the countryside to secure supplies and demoralize the opposition. This wasn't the work of faceless soldiers alone. It was a standard, accepted tactic led by the warrior class. Stories from conflicts like the 100 Years' War are filled with accounts of knights participating in actions that would be considered severe breaches of that famous code, from the targeting of non-combatants to the breaking of truces for tactical advantage. The chivalric ideal itself was not a single, static rulebook. It evolved over centuries, a blend of martial skill, religious devotion, and courtly manners that was often emphasized more in peaceful tournament halls than on muddy, chaotic battlefields. It served as a powerful aspirational framework, a way for the nobility to justify their privileged position in society. But in the heat of a desperate fight or during a bitter feud over inheritance, those aspirations could be quickly set aside. This doesn't mean every knight was a villain, far from it, but it does mean we must see them as complete human beings, capable of great courage and devastating cruelty, driven by the same mix of ambition, fear, loyalty, and opportunity that motivates people in any era. The myth of universal chivalry simplifies them into cardboard cutouts, stripping away the very human contradictions that make their true history so compelling. If their moral compass was so frequently swayed by practical concerns, it forces us to question another foundational piece of the Hollywood legend, the idea that every knight was a wealthy lord living in a stone castle. The idea that every knight was a landed lord dripping in gold is a fantasy built on castle walls. Hollywood's persistent image of universal knightly wealth collapses under the weight of simple economics. The title of knight was not a guaranteed ticket to prosperity. It was often a crushing financial obligation. To even qualify, a man had to afford the full panoply of war, a staggering list that included multiple war horses, custom-fitted armor, weapons, and the wages for a small retinue of squires and men-at-arms. This was an investment comparable to buying a fleet of luxury cars today, and it was just the entry fee. Maintaining this status, paying for repairs, and funding participation in military campaigns could quickly drain a family's resources. This created a vast economic spectrum within the knightly class. At the very top were magnates like William Marshall, who rose through martial skill and political savvy to become one of the richest men in England. But for every marshal, there were dozens of knights of modest means. Many were minor landowners holding just a single manor whose rents barely covered their nightly expenses. Documents from the 14th century are filled with records of knights petitioning the crown for financial relief, selling parcels of land, or even falling into debt as they struggled to uphold the station society expected of them. Then there were the landless knights, often called knights bachelor, who owned no estate at all. These men were professional warriors in the truest sense, hiring out their lance and their expertise to wealthier lords or kings, essentially serving as high-status mercenaries to make a living. Their experience was not one of courtly opulence, but of garrison life, campaign pay, and the constant hustle to secure the next contract. This economic reality forces us to see knighthood not as a monolithic caste, but as a profession with wildly different lifestyles. The journey of a landless knight bachelor riding from one employer to the next looks very different from the cinematic lord in his great hall. It begins to resemble a far more familiar and far more solitary Hollywood trope, one that is itself deeply flawed, the romantic image of the lone knight-errant. The solitary wanderer, the knight-errant riding alone into the sunset, is a powerful story but a historical phantom. This romantic figure, born from the pages of chivalric romance and perfected by cinema, represents a fifth deep misunderstanding of how knights actually lived and moved through the medieval world. The reality was one of profound connection, not isolation. A knight was a node in a vast feudal network, bound by solemn oaths of loyalty and service to a lord above him and responsible for the men below him. His identity was not forged in solitude, but through his place in a rigid hierarchy of family, land, and military obligation. He did not simply choose to wander, he was called to serve, and that service demanded a support system. Travel in the Middle Ages was a formidable undertaking, fraught with peril from rough terrain, unpredictable weather, and the very real threat of banditry. A knight traveling alone would have been not only vulnerable but also visibly impoverished, lacking the basic necessities for maintaining his gear, his horses, and his own status. Therefore, a knight on the move was never truly alone. He traveled with his household, a small mobile community that might include one or more squires in training, a few professional men at arms, a page, and servants to handle logistics like cooking, caring for the horses, and maintaining the armor. This retinue was a practical necessity for protection and daily function, but it was also a walking display of the knight's social standing and wealth. Historical documents like muster rolls, which listed who showed up for a campaign, and detailed household account books consistently show knights embedded within these larger units. They are recorded as part of a lord's contingent, leading their own small groups of followers, not as freelance agents. The literary knight-errant, from the tales of King Arthur's court to the fictional exploits of Don Quixote's inspiration, was a nostalgic fantasy even in its own time, a poetic ideal of individual agency in a world where everyone's life was defined by their connections to others. To imagine a knight truly alone is to strip him of the very social fabric that gave him meaning, power, and purpose. It reduces a complex historical figure to a lonely cowboy, a silhouette against the sky, when in truth he was always part of a bustling, noisy, interdependent caravan. And speaking of what he carried with him, no piece of that caravan has been more misunderstood than the very shell he lived in, the legendary plate armor that supposedly turned men into clumsy, immobilized tanks. The idea of a knight clanking helplessly, needing a crane to reach his saddle, is pure cinematic invention. This sixth myth of cumbersome, immobile armor is one of the most stubborn, yet it has been completely dismantled by both historical research and hands-on experimentation. A full suit of plate armor from the late medieval period, the kind most often depicted in films, was a marvel of functional design, not a prison of steel. Its total weight typically ranged between 45 and 55 pounds, a load that sounds significant until you realize it was expertly distributed across the entire body through a system of straps and carefully balanced plates. This even distribution made the weight feel far less than carrying a heavy backpack on your shoulders. Modern reenactors wearing accurate reproductions can run, climb ladders, mount horses without assistance, and even perform cartwheels and rolls. The armor was custom fitted to its wearer, with articulated joints at the knees, elbows, and shoulders that allowed for a fluid range of motion. Combat manuals from the period show knights in full plate engaging in sophisticated grappling, wrestling, and agile swordplay, techniques that would be impossible if they were truly immobilized. The myth likely stems from two sources. First, the much heavier and more restrictive ceremonial parade armor of later centuries, which was never meant for battle. And second, a confusion with earlier periods where knights wore long hauberks of chainmail, which were indeed heavier for their protective value and could be more fatiguing. By the 15th century, armorers were engineers of human movement, crafting protective shells that enhanced a knight's martial capability rather than hindering it. To believe the myth is to underestimate centuries of craftsmanship and the incredible physical conditioning of the warriors who wore this gear. They trained for hours in these suits, building the strength and endurance to fight effectively within them. Their mobility was a key to survival, allowing them to close distance, regain their footing if knocked down, and adapt to the chaos of the melee. But if a knight's armor granted such impressive mobility and protection, it makes the nature of the threats they faced all the more critical to understand. What happened when that engineering masterpiece was finally breached, when a weapon found its way through a joint or a lucky strike landed true? The reality of battlefield medicine, or more accurately, the stark lack of it, becomes the next sobering chapter in separating Hollywood heroics from historical hardship. A single, clean sword stroke rarely ended a knight's story on the medieval battlefield. The seventh myth we must dismantle is the Hollywood fantasy of instant death from any wound, a trope that replaces the grim, protracted reality of pre-modern combat with a kind of lethal neatness. In truth, the very armor we just discussed was designed to make a knight extraordinarily difficult to kill quickly. A sword slash against plate was often useless, and even a powerful blow from a mace was meant to stun and incapacitate, not necessarily to end a life in one hit. The real dangers were more insidious: a puncture through a joint, a deep cut to a limb once a fight reached the grappling stage, or the devastating force of a crossbow bolt that could find a gap in the defenses. These were horrific injuries, but they were frequently not immediately fatal. The aftermath was where the true struggle began. A knight who fell wounded on the field faced a cascade of threats, from blood loss to the crushing press of combat around him. If he was fortunate enough to be pulled from the fray by his comrades, his battle for survival was just entering a new, agonizing phase. Infection was the great shadow over all battlefield medicine, a mysterious and terrifying force that medieval surgeons fought with the limited knowledge they had. Their toolkit, however, was not one of pure ignorance. Historical texts describe practices like cauterizing wounds with hot oil or a red-hot iron to stop bleeding, and in their understanding, seal out bad air. They knew to probe for and remove arrowheads or fragments, and they used herbal poultices and clean bandages in attempts to prevent the spread of illness. The goal was stabilization, to give the body a chance to heal itself, and remarkably, it sometimes worked. Archaeological evidence provides stunning proof of this resilience. The skeletal remains from the Battle of Towton in England, one of the bloodiest clashes of the Wars of the Roses, tell a story not just of death but of survival. Examinations have revealed men with grievous facial and skull injuries that showed clear signs of healing, sometimes over many years. These were individuals who had survived terrible trauma in earlier conflicts, their bones knitting back together, only to meet their end on another field. This evidence shatters the image of the disposable warrior. It reveals a world where violence was a recurring professional hazard, and recovery was a painful, lengthy, but possible journey. Furthermore, a knight's high social status often served as his greatest lifeline. the concept of ransom was a cornerstone of medieval warfare, a brutal but economically rational system. Capturing a wealthy knight was far more valuable than killing him. A living prisoner could be exchanged for a small fortune in gold or used as a political bargaining chip. This incentive meant that once a knight was subdued, the immediate goal shifted from execution to securing a lucrative asset. His survival, while leading to imprisonment and hardship, was in the financial interest of his captor. So the cinematic moment of a knight falling silently to the ground is a profound simplification. It erases the hours of suffering, the frantic efforts of friends, the crude but earnest attempts at surgery, and the complex economic calculations that could spare a life. It replaces the chaotic, noisy, and uncertain reality of the medieval battlefield, where the clash of steel was just the beginning of the story, with a quiet, decisive, and misleading end. And that chaotic reality itself, the nature of the battle, is our next point of correction, moving from the fate of the individual to the misunderstood spectacle of the mass melee. The sprawling cinematic brawl, a sea of indistinguishable knights locked in endless, frenzied combat, is a powerful visual but a profound historical distortion. This eighth myth of the perpetual chaotic melee ignores the careful, often chess-like strategy that defined medieval warfare at its highest levels. Commanders were not mere brawlers leading a charge. They were tacticians who understood the critical value of discipline, formation, and terrain. The iconic Battle of Agincourt was not won by English knights in a wild free-for-all. It was a victory of preparation and positioning. The English army, heavily outnumbered, chose a narrow field flanked by woods, funneling the massive French cavalry into a killing zone churned into deep mud by rain. Their lines of longbowmen, protected by sharpened stakes, unleashed storms of arrows not at random, but in coordinated volleys designed to break the momentum of the charge and create havoc among the tightly packed French knights. This was calculated psychological and physical warfare. Similarly, at the Battle of Hastings, William the Conqueror's use of a feigned retreat was a masterclass in tactical deception, a risky maneuver that required incredible discipline from his Norman knights to execute without collapsing into real panic. They lured sections of the English shield wall into breaking formation, then turned and cut them down. On the field, knights fought in units called convois, clustered around their lord's banner, a visible rallying point in the dust and noise. Their role in a cavalry charge was not to individually duel, but to act as a single, shattering hammer blow against an enemy line. Communication through banners, trumpets, and shouted orders was constant. The press of combat could and did descend into brutal, close-quarters chaos, but this was the consequence of a plan coming apart, not the plan itself. To reduce these engagements to mindless scrums is to strip medieval commanders and the knights who followed them of their professional intellect. It overlooks the years of training in not just swordsmanship, but in maneuvering as part of a larger body, in responding to signals, and in understanding the broader objective of the battle. Warfare was their profession, and like any profession, it had its theories, its best practices, and its brilliant, if brutal, practitioners. This focus on the organized, strategic nature of their work on the battlefield shifts our perspective from the collective to the individual, prompting a question about the rhythm of their lives. If warfare was this structured, how much of their time was actually spent in combat? The answer dismantles another cherished piece of the Hollywood timeline, the myth of the knight in perpetual, year-round conflict. The relentless warrior, forever marching from one battlefield to the next, is a timeline written by Hollywood, not by history. Our ninth myth is the knight in perpetual conflict, a figure whose life is defined by an unbroken chain of crusades and clashes. This dramatic compression ignores the fundamental rhythms of medieval life, where warfare was a seasonal, logistical undertaking, not a default state of being. For the vast majority of knights, the call to arms was an exceptional event, punctuating long stretches of peace defined by entirely different responsibilities. Think of a modern professional soldier. They train constantly, but they are not in active combat every single day. Their life is filled with maintenance, administration, and preparation. A knight's world functioned on a similar principle, just on a much larger, more personal scale. His primary identity was often that of a landowner and a local authority. When not summoned by his lord, his days were consumed by the management of his estate, overseeing crops, settling disputes among tenants, and ensuring the collection of rents that funded his very way of life. Many knights served as sheriffs, judges, or royal officials, roles that required literacy, knowledge of law, and diplomatic skill far more than swordsmanship. Historical documents, like the detailed household accounts of the 14th century knight Sir John de Moulton, reveal a mundane reality of purchasing cloth, paying servants, buying horseshoes, and funding local church repairs. His calendar was marked by social obligations, hunting trips which served as both recreation and vital training, and attendance at his lord's court to reaffirm bonds and discuss regional politics. The Great Crusades, while monumental in cultural memory, were massive, expensive undertakings that mobilized only a small percentage of the European knightly class at any one time. For every knight who took the cross and journeyed to the Holy Land, dozens remained at home, tending to the stability of the realm. Campaigns themselves were largely confined to the summer and early autumn months, when roads were passable and fields could provide forage for armies. The idea of year-round warfare was a logistical and economic impossibility. To believe the myth of constant war is to misunderstand the medieval world's deep craving for order and governance. A knight was not just a weapon, he was a pillar of a functioning society, an administrator in armor whose sword spent more time on the wall than in his hand. This multifaceted life, balancing the ledger and the lance, forces us to re-examine even the most basic elements of his battlefield presence. How did this complex figure, so engaged in the minutiae of daily life, actually function when the helmet was finally donned and the field of battle awaited? The answer lies in shattering our 10th myth, the iconic but utterly impractical image of the knight sealed inside a full-face helmet, blind and mute to the world around him. The sealed great helm, a symbol of faceless intimidation, is a piece of cinematic drama that would have gotten a knight killed. Our 10th myth is the idea that knights fought blind and deaf, encased in steel that isolated them from the vital sights and sounds of the battlefield. This ignores the fundamental truth of armor design. Every piece was a careful compromise between maximum protection and essential functionality. Helmet evolution tells this story perfectly. Early great helms, the cylindrical pots seen in Crusader imagery, did offer immense protection for the head and face, but they were cumbersome, with limited vision and poor ventilation. They were best suited for the initial shock of a cavalry charge or for the highly structured context of a joust, where the knight faced a single, predictable opponent. For the messy, dynamic reality of a prolonged infantry battle, something more versatile was needed. Enter the bassinet, a helmet that became the workhorse of the 14th and 15th centuries. It was an open-faced helmet that could be worn alone for maximum awareness, but its genius lay in the addition of a hinged visor, often called a clap visor. This visor could be snapped shut moments before impact, providing full facial protection, then lifted again to allow the knight to breathe easily, see clearly, and communicate with his comrades. The sight lines through these visors and the breathing holes drilled into them were carefully calculated to offer the widest possible field of view and ample airflow without creating fatal weak points. Archaeological finds and artistic depictions show knights in the thick of preparation with their visors raised, checking equipment, shouting orders, and scanning the field. They relied on hearing the blare of trumpets, the shouted commands of their lords, and the changing roar of the crowd to understand the flow of the fight. To be cut off from these senses was to become a liability, a lone figure stumbling in a metal shell. The Hollywood image of the perpetually sealed knight strips away their situational awareness, a warrior's most critical asset. It turns a sophisticated, adaptable piece of equipment into a clumsy plot device, underestimating the armorers who were, in every sense, masters of human ergonomics long before the word existed. This focus on the knight's physical perception of the world around him leads us to another deeply romanticized area of his life, one that shaped his reputation far from the battlefield, the complex and often misunderstood world of courtly love. The heart of a knight, as portrayed in countless tales of courtly love, is perhaps the most beautifully embroidered fiction of all. This 11th myth presents the knight as a poetic devotee, performing heroic deeds solely for the favor of a distant, idealized lady, a narrative that owes far more to the troubadours of 12th century Aquitaine than to the historical record. Courtly love, or fin amour, was indeed a powerful cultural phenomenon, but it was first and foremost a sophisticated literary game played in aristocratic circles. It was a set of rules for flirtation, poetic expression, and social performance, often centered on the chaste, secret admiration of a married lady of higher status. This created a safe space for exploring themes of desire and devotion without threatening the rigid structures of marriage, which for knights were almost exclusively alliances of land, power, and political strategy. A knight's wedding was a contractual milestone, merging estates and securing loyalties, with personal affection being a fortunate bonus rather than a primary requirement. The idea that a knight would risk his life and feudal obligations for a poetic abstraction, while a lovely story, simply does not align with the practical priorities that governed his world. This is not to say the ideal had no influence. At tournaments, knights might carry a lady's token, a sleeve or a scarf, and dedicate their performance in the lists to her honor. This was pageantry, a public demonstration of grace and courtesy that enhanced the social prestige of both participants. But once the festivities ended, the knight returned to the management of his lands, the collection of rents, and the planning of military campaigns alongside his wife, who was often a crucial partner in administering their shared estate. The courtly love tradition gave us an enduring vocabulary of romance, but it projected the fantasies of poets onto the lives of warriors. It created a parallel, idealized universe of emotion that existed in song and story, while the real relationships of the medieval elite were built on the far more durable foundations of duty, partnership, and shared economic survival. This romantic distortion doesn't just color our view of their private lives. It has also painted a deeply misleading picture of how they conducted themselves in war, leading to our next great cinematic fallacy, the notion of the chivalric one-on-one duel. The dramatic single combat, a knight stepping forward to decide a battle's fate, is a scene written for the stage, not the field. Hollywood's 12th myth, the frequent chivalric duel, replaces the messy reality of collective warfare with a tidy, heroic spectacle. While the image of two armored champions clashing before a watching army is undeniably powerful, it represents an extreme rarity in historical warfare, not a standard practice. Commanders understood that battles were won by disciplined formations and coordinated maneuvers, not by the unpredictable outcome of a one-on-one fight that could shatter the cohesion of an entire line. Allowing your best knights to break ranks for personal glory was not chivalry, it was tactical insanity. The chaos of a melee with its press of bodies, falling horses, and obscured vision left little room for the elaborate, courteous duels of legend. A knight's duty was to his lord's banner and the men beside him, to hold the line and push forward as a single, brutal instrument. Where regulated duels did exist, they served a very specific legal purpose. The judicial duel, or trial by combat, was a solemn, ritualized method to settle certain disputes where evidence was lacking. seen as a way for divine judgment to reveal the truth. These were formal, often public events governed by strict rules, not spontaneous clashes on a battlefield. Similarly, the tournament lists provided a controlled arena for single combat, but even there, the early melees were massive, chaotic group fights, and the formal joust evolved into a highly specialized sport with its own equipment and conventions, separate from the dirtier work of war. Historical chronicles do record a handful of famous arranged combats, like the duel between the French knight Jean de Carouge and the squire Jacques Legris in 1386. But these were sensational precisely because they were extraordinary legal proceedings, not examples of battlefield behavior. The myth stems from the later Romantic retellings of medieval stories, where authors amplified individual heroism for a listening audience. To believe knights commonly dueled in the thick of battle is to misunderstand the fundamental nature of medieval warfare as a collective endeavor, where the machine mattered far more than any single gear. And that machine, across different centuries, was clad in a variety of protective shells, leading us directly to our 13th correction, a misconception about the armor itself and the era it truly defines. That shining full-plate suit is a visitor from the wrong century, a time traveler misplaced by Hollywood's imagination. The 13th great myth we must correct is the idea that plate armor was the constant uniform of the Middle Ages. This anachronism is everywhere, from films set during the early Crusades to dramas about the Norman conquest, showing knights clad head to toe in articulated steel plates centuries before such technology existed. The reality is a story of slow, brilliant evolution, a 500-year journey from one form of protection to another. For the vast majority of the medieval period, the knight's primary defense was the hauberk, a long shirt of interlocking iron rings known as mail. This was a marvel of craftsmanship in its own right, flexible and effective against slashing cuts, but incredibly heavy and vulnerable to the crushing force of a direct blow. The iconic knight of the 11th century, like those who fought with William the Conqueror, would have worn this mail coat, perhaps with a simple conical helmet and a large, kite-shaped shield. The shift toward plate was a gradual process of problem-solving. First, additional plates were strapped over the mail at the most vulnerable points, the knees and elbows. Then a breastplate appeared to protect the torso, followed by articulated defenses for the arms and legs. The full suit of plate, a walking fortress of polished steel, did not reach its zenith until the 15th century, a brief golden age of perhaps 75 years before the proliferation of effective gunpowder weapons began to render it obsolete. This means the famous knight in shining armor represents the very end of the story, not its entirety. By compressing this long technological march into a single, timeless image, Hollywood does more than just get the date wrong. It erases the incredible diversity of martial fashion across Europe, from the distinctive Italian styles to the fluted German designs, and it overlooks the constant, deadly innovation that drove armorers to become the engineers of their age. This focus on technological evolution across centuries naturally shifts our gaze from the equipment to the people who wore it, challenging another monolithic assumption. If armor changed so dramatically from the First Crusade to the Wars of the Roses, can we still speak of knights as a single, uniform culture? The answer unravels the next great fiction, the myth of the knight as an exclusively European Christian warrior. The knight's world was far wider than the borders of Christendom. Our 14th myth, that knights were exclusively European Christians, shrinks a global tapestry of martial tradition into a single, familiar thread. While the feudal knight is a defining symbol of medieval Western Europe, the concept of a heavily armored, elite-mounted warrior bound by a code of honor was a recurring idea across continents and cultures. In the Islamic world, the Faris embodied a similar ideal, a skilled cavalryman celebrated in poetry for his horsemanship, courage, and often his piety. The Byzantine Empire fielded the cataphract, a lance-armed cavalryman clad in lamellar armor, a direct successor to the heavy horsemen of the ancient world. And though their societal structure was distinct, the Japanese samurai shared profound parallels with European knights, as a hereditary warrior class bound by a strict code of Bushido, serving a lord in exchange for land and valuing personal honor above all. Hollywood's persistent focus on the European model not only sidelines these fascinating counterparts, but it also misses the rich exchanges that occurred even within Europe's own sphere. The Crusades, often portrayed as a simple clash of civilizations, were in reality a prolonged period of intense cultural and military cross-pollination. European knights in the Holy Land adopted local tactics, styles of armor, and even weapons from their opponents. The iconic Great Helm may have been influenced by designs seen in the Middle East. Back in Spain, during the centuries-long Reconquista, Christian and Islamic knights fought, negotiated, and at times allied with one another, their martial cultures constantly influencing each other's equipment and techniques. To see the knight as a purely European Christian invention is to embrace a narrow, outdated view of history. It ignores the universal human impulse to create a warrior elite and the constant flow of ideas that shaped warfare from Britain to Baghdad. Recognizing this global context doesn't diminish the European knight. It places him in a more accurate and interesting light, as one brilliant variation on a theme played across the medieval world. This broader cultural perspective makes the next practical misconception all the more striking, because if knights were part of a worldwide tradition of mounted warriors, why do we so often picture them fighting on the ground? A knight's identity was inseparable from his horse, yet he was never its prisoner. The 15th myth we must leave behind is the idea that knights always and only fought from the saddle. That thunderous charge is a defining image, but it represents just one tool in a much larger tactical box. The reality of medieval warfare demanded profound versatility, and a professional knight was expected to be as formidable on the ground as he was on horseback. Circumstances routinely dictated a dismounted role. During a grueling siege, a horse was of little use scaling a ladder or fighting on a narrow wall walk. In dense forests or boggy ground, cavalry became a liability, vulnerable to ambush and unable to maneuver. And on battlefields where enemy archers or disciplined pikemen held the field, a commander's wisest choice was often to order his knights to dismount. They would form a solid, heavily armored infantry block, an unbreakable anchor around which the rest of the army could maneuver. The 100 Years' War provides textbook examples of this pragmatic shift. At the Battle of Crécy, French knights insisted on charging the English longbowmen with catastrophic results. Just decades later, English commanders had learned the lesson. At the pivotal Battle of Agincourt, King Henry V ordered almost all of his men-at-arms, the knights and professional soldiers, to fight on foot. They formed a defensive line, their poleaxes and swords ready to meet the exhausted, mud-slowed French cavalry who finally reached them. This was not a sign of weakness, but of intelligent adaptation. Training for knighthood reflected this dual necessity. While mastering the quintain for the joust and practicing mounted swordsmanship was essential, squires also spent countless hours drilling in foot combat. They learned to fight with polearms, to grapple in armor, and to maintain formation. A knight was fundamentally a heavily armored professional soldier, and his value lay in his ability to fulfill whatever role the battle required. To reduce him to a cavalry-only figure is to ignore the complex chess game of medieval tactics, where the most expensive piece on the board sometimes had to get off its horse and fight like a pawn with superior armor. This very adaptability speaks to a more nuanced mind than Hollywood often allows, raising a question about the tools of the intellect, not just the tools of war. If their battlefield roles required such calculated thinking, What does that tell us about their minds and their access to knowledge? The answer dismantles a 16th myth, one that paints them as uneducated brutes in metal shells. The image of the knight as a grunting, illiterate brute is a caricature that sells tickets but betrays history. Our 16th myth to dismantle is the idea that knights were uneducated men concerned solely with strength and violence. This stereotype ignores a fundamental shift in the very definition of knighthood as the Middle Ages progressed. While early knights in the centuries following the year 1000 might have prioritized martial skill above all, the role evolved dramatically. By the 12th and 13th centuries, a knight was increasingly expected to be a courtier, a diplomat, and a local governor. To fulfill these duties, a functioning mind was as important as a strong arm. Sons of the nobility, destined for knighthood, often began their education as pages in a lord's household, where training extended far beyond the tiltyard. They were taught to read and write, frequently in their local vernacular like French or English, and sometimes even in Latin, the language of the church and serious scholarship. They studied law, as settling disputes among tenants was a daily part of managing an estate. They learned music, poetry, and the intricate rules of courtly behavior, not as frivolous hobbies, but as essential social skills for navigating the politics of a royal court. Consider the real figure of Geoffroy de Charny, a French knight of the 14th century renowned for his martial prowess. He was also the author of several works, including a thoughtful book on chivalry that pondered the balance between religious devotion, knightly honor, and practical warfare. His writing reveals a man deeply engaged with the philosophical ideals of his profession, not a mindless thug. This intellectual engagement was part of a broader cultural awakening. The so-called Renaissance of the 12th century saw a flourishing of literature, law, and architecture, and knights were active participants. They were patrons of poets and musicians, commissioners of illuminated manuscripts, and builders of chapels and castles that were feats of engineering as much as military design. The ability to comprehend a financial ledger, to understand a legal charter, or to compose a courteous letter was a marker of status and a tool of power. To reduce the knight to a simple brute is to ignore the complex administrative machinery of the medieval world, a machinery they were often tasked with operating. It strips them of their humanity, denying them the capacity for reflection, art, and governance that the historical record clearly demonstrates. This richer picture of the knightly mind, capable of both crafting a verse and leading a charge, complicates another sweeping assumption about their inner world. If their intellectual and cultural lives were this nuanced, can we still assume their religious devotion was always simple, universal, and pure? Faith was a powerful current, but it did not carry every knight in the same direction. The 17th myth that all knights were deeply religious crusaders paints their spirituality with a single, broad brush that ignores the vast spectrum of personal belief and worldly ambition. Religion was the backdrop of the medieval world, the air they breathed, but how each individual knight chose to breathe it varied dramatically. For some, the call to crusade was a genuine, fervent expression of piety, a chance to earn spiritual salvation through holy warfare. Yet for many others, the same journey represented a more earthly opportunity, a path to land, wealth, and political prestige that might be impossible to attain at home. Historical records are remarkably candid about these mixed motives. Chroniclers note knights who joined a crusade primarily to escape debts or legal troubles, viewing the expedition as a chance for a fresh start. Others saw the wealthy cities of the East as a target for plunder, their eyes fixed on material gain rather than spiritual reward. Even within the structure of the church, the ideal of the devout warrior was often challenged by reality. There are accounts of knights engaging in simony, the buying of church offices, or openly ignoring directives from bishops when it conflicted with their family's interests. Their primary loyalty was frequently to their feudal lord, not a distant pope, and political alliances could easily trump religious unity, sometimes leading to conflict between Christian factions. The behavior on campaign itself often strayed far from Christian teachings, with documented instances of looting, violence against local Christian populations in Byzantine territories, and a brutal pragmatism that shocked even some contemporary observers. This is not to label knights as universally hypocritical, but to recognize them as complex human beings navigating a world where faith, duty, and personal ambition were constantly intertwined. The Crusader was one role a knight might play, but it was never his only identity. Reducing him to a simple, God-fearing zealot erases the difficult choices, the moral compromises, and the very human calculations that defined life in a turbulent age. It turns a profound and often contradictory historical experience into a one-dimensional Sunday school lesson. And if their participation in the holy wars was often a blend of piety and pragmatism, what does that tell us about their other great staged spectacle, the tournament? Here, Hollywood has crafted another grand fiction, one of constant, glamorous, and deadly sport. The tournament was not a weekly spectacle, but a carefully orchestrated event with a purpose far deeper than Hollywood's pageantry. Our 18th myth inflates these gatherings into a constant, glamorous pastime, when in reality they were infrequent, regulated, and intensely practical affairs. A major tournament was a logistical feat requiring months of planning, the movement of hundreds of knights and their retinues, and a safe venue granted by a king or powerful lord. They did not happen on a whim, but were scheduled around the agricultural calendar and political stability, making them rare highlights in a knight's year. While the joust with its iconic clash of lances captures our imagination, the early tournament's main event was often the melee, a massive mock battle fought over miles of countryside with blunted but still dangerous weapons. This was not gentle sport, it was the closest simulation to real combat available, a vital training ground where knights practiced unit cohesion, battlefield communication, and individual skill under pressure. Injuries were common, and fatalities, while not the goal, were an accepted risk of the profession. In fact, these events were so disruptive and potentially seditious that they were periodically banned by authorities like King Henry II of England, who feared they could become cover for rebellion or simply drain the kingdom of its military elite in pointless accidents. Beyond training, the tournament served crucial social and political functions. It was a networking convention for the warrior class where alliances were forged, reputations were built, and younger knights could catch the eye of a potential patron. The lavish displays of heraldry, the expensive armor, and the feasting that followed were all demonstrations of wealth and status, reinforcing the social hierarchy. To see tournaments as mere entertainment is to miss their role as the engine of knightly culture, maintaining readiness, facilitating diplomacy, and affirming the power structures of the medieval world. They were a working holiday, blending necessity with celebration, a far cry from the perpetual, romanticized festival of the silver screen. This focus on the physical demands and very real dangers of their profession, even in training, leads us to a final, poignant misconception about the knight's own body and the length of his career. If the tournament was this demanding, and warfare even more so, what does that tell us about the lifespan and resilience of these warriors? The knight's story was not always cut short by a sword. Our 19th myth, that knights inevitably died young in battle, is a casualty of Hollywood's need for dramatic endings. While the profession was undeniably perilous, the historical evidence reveals a surprising resilience, with many knights living well into their 40s, 50s, and even their 60s, their final chapters written far from the battlefield. Consider the practical realities. A major campaign might last a single season, and a knight could spend years, even decades, between such callings. In those long stretches, the greatest threats were not foreign lances, but the universal hardships of the era, from illness to accidents. Historical records like family genealogies, wills, and chronicles are filled with knights who survived multiple conflicts only to pass from sickness or simply from age. Their final acts focused on securing their estate for their heirs. The famous William Marshal, often called the greatest knight of his age, lived into his 70s, serving as regent of England long after his fighting days were done. The often cited low average lifespan of the Middle Ages is skewed by the tragic prevalence of infant loss and widespread health challenges. Knights, as members of the elite, generally had better nutrition, safer living conditions, and access to whatever medical care existed, factors that significantly increased their chances of a longer life. They were the professional athletes of their time, trained from youth and conditioned to withstand hardship. To believe they all died young is to accept a narrative where the only conclusion is a violent one, ignoring the quieter, more common realities of retirement, governance, and family life. It overlooks the knight who spent his later years arbitrating local disputes, expanding his manor house, or doting on his grandchildren, a figure far removed from the glorious corpse on a cinematic field. This longevity itself, however, varied dramatically across the centuries and social ranks, pointing us toward the final, all-encompassing fiction we must confront, the idea of the knight as a single, timeless archetype. The final great fiction is that knights were ever a single, unchanging thing. Our 20th myth flattens 5 centuries of history into a single, static stereotype, ignoring the constant evolution that defined the very idea of knighthood. A mounted warrior in the year 1000, clad in mail and owing service for his land, would barely recognize the title as it existed by the year 1500. What began as a practical military role, a heavily armored horseman, slowly transformed into a complex social and legal rank, a status loaded with cultural expectations and financial burdens. This evolution was driven by relentless forces, economic shifts that made the equipment ruinously expensive, political centralization that reduced the need for private armies, and the rise of professional soldiers who fought for pay, not feudal obligation. The change was so profound that by the late Middle Ages, men who qualified for knighthood often paid fines to avoid it, finding the ceremonial costs and public duties more trouble than the title was worth. In England, the distraint of knighthood became a regular royal practice, essentially taxing wealthy landowners who refused the honor. Across Europe, the title could sometimes be purchased outright, severing its last direct ties to battlefield prowess. To speak of a knight is therefore meaningless without asking which century, which kingdom, which man. The gulf between a landless knight bachelor hiring out his lance in France and a powerful English magnate like Richard Neville, the Kingmaker, leading private armies in the Wars of the Roses, is a chasm of experience, power, and purpose. Regional variations added another layer of diversity, from the courtly traditions of Burgundy to the militarized frontier societies of Spain and the Teutonic Order's state in Prussia. Hollywood's monolithic knight erases this breathtaking diversity, this slow march from function to form, from warrior to gentleman. It trades a messy, living history for a clean, timeless symbol. Having journeyed through these 20 corrections, a final question remains. Why do these myths cling so stubbornly to our imagination? Their persistence reveals less about the Middle Ages and more about our own need for story. We simplify to create clear heroes and villains, we amplify spectacle over subtlety, and we often prefer a comforting legend to a complicated truth. The real knight, however, is far more compelling. He is not a polished statue, but a human being navigating a world of brutal pragmatism and lofty ideals, of rust and poetry, of ledger books and lances. By letting go of the myth, we do not lose a hero. We gain a glimpse into a richer, stranger, and infinitely more real past. The enduring power of these myths speaks to something deeper than simple error. They persist because they fulfill a fundamental human desire for clarity in a chaotic past, offering archetypes of heroism, villainy, and romance that are instantly recognizable. A gleaming suit of armor is a visual shorthand for nobility. A lone knight-errant embodies our longing for individual agency. A chivalric code provides a comforting moral compass in a brutal world. These simplified narratives are not just convenient for filmmakers, they resonate because they reflect values we cherish today, like personal honor and romantic love, projected backward onto a canvas of castles and sword fights. In this way, Hollywood's medieval period often tells us more about the 20th and 21st centuries than it does about the 14th. The complexity of feudal contracts, the gritty economics of land management, and the ambiguous morality of historical figures are difficult to translate into a 2-hour blockbuster. It is far easier and often more satisfying for an audience to watch a clear hero defend the helpless against a clear villain. This process of myth-making is not new, of course. The medieval nobility themselves commissioned poets to burnish their own legends, transforming ambitious, flawed men into paragons of virtue. Hollywood is simply the latest chapter in a very long tradition of reshaping the past to serve the needs of the present. Recognizing this does not mean we must reject these stories outright. There is value in the way they keep the imagery and ideals of the medieval world alive in our collective imagination. They spark curiosity, they inspire fascination, and they provide a gateway. The key is to engage with them critically, to enjoy the spectacle while understanding the deeper, richer history that lies beneath the polished surface. When we separate the myth from the man, we do not lose the romance of history, we gain its true texture, the awe that comes from confronting a reality that is stranger, more resilient, and more human than any fiction. This journey through 20 misconceptions is an invitation to apply that same curious eye to other eras, to question the tropes that shape our view of ancient Rome, the Wild West, or the age of piracy. The past is not a static backdrop for our stories, it is a dynamic, challenging conversation. By seeking a balance between the compelling power of myth and the rigorous pursuit of fact, we honor both our need for story and our respect for the truth, ensuring the knights of history are remembered not as fairy tale props, but as the complex, formidable people they truly were. Our journey through these 20 myths is more than a checklist of corrections. It is a reminder that history resists the simplicity of a screenplay. We have replaced the solitary wanderer with a man bound by feudal ties, the clumsy tank with an agile athlete, and the timeless archetype with a figure constantly reinvented by economics and war. This richer portrait does not diminish the knight, it completes him. He emerges not as a fantasy prop, but as a full human being, navigating a world where rust was as real as romance, and a ledger book could be as important as a lance. The true value of this exercise lies not in proving Hollywood wrong, but in rediscovering the profound humanity of the past. When we look past the shining surface of myth, we find individuals making difficult choices within the limits of their era, striving for honor, survival, and legacy in ways that are both alien and deeply familiar. This process of questioning our assumptions is the very heart of engaging with history. It transforms passive consumption into active discovery, turning every legend into a doorway. What other stories have we accepted without a second glance? The walls of every era are covered in similar layers of varnish, from the gladiators of Rome to the gunslingers of the American frontier, waiting for a curious mind to look closer. If this exploration into the world of the medieval knight has shifted your perspective, we would love to hear which revelation struck you most powerfully in the comments. For more journeys that separate cinematic spectacle from historical substance, be sure to subscribe. Until our next adventure into the past, keep asking questions and keep seeking the real stories behind the screen.